Somehow, one of the most heroic things Sherlock could do was kill someone and risk a death sentence in order to protect Watson and Mary, which isn't the only impressive thing this story features. Of course, another odious villain, Charles Augustus Magnusson, played with snake-like grace by Lars Mikkelsen. Magnusson is a disgusting, contemptuous villain who thrives on utilizing secrets to gain political power over his enemies. This episode is also the first story to really show how dangerous Sherlock can be to himself and others without his friends, starting with his first dalliance with heroin and his callous manipulation of Janine just so he can get access to Magnusson's office. You actually see the dangerous downward spiral Sherlock is going down just to slay the dragon. Then, in that instant, when he realizes John and Mary are threatened by this man, the stakes are personal now. This is not just a case anymore. This is about Sherlock fulfilling his vow to protect his friends and going to dangerous lengths to do this. Meanwhile, you also have the strong emotional scenes between Watson and Mary as he comes to terms with Mary's dark past. If ever there was an episode that showed Sherlock's devotion to his friends, it's this one. It is amazing how a story can have so much happening at once and still keep a strong focus on tone and still be so much damn fun. Effectively using John and Mary's wedding as a center for the story, it gave a chance to show Sherlock trying desperately to do what normal people do. We've seen Sherlock fight scimitar-wielding madmen in his living room with manic aplomb, but at the minute he has to do a best man speech, it's like getting someone to tell you the truth without cowering behind Saraha.com. Then, just when you think the story was going to focus on the wedding, we still get a particularly intriguing case interwoven into the proceedings, involving a mysterious stabbing and a particularly dangerous internet troll who's inexplicably seducing multiple women all over London. Better still, we are also presented with the most ill-conceived stag night in history. It all culminates into the most unashamedly fun episode of the series. Moriarty has been the devil hidden in the shadows all throughout the first series, and this story, we knew he was going to make his first appearance in this season finale, but this story does an incredible job building up our anticipation for the inevitable arrival of Holmes' nemesis. The best way for them to do that is to put his malice and genius on display simultaneously. For extra measure, we even get some intriguing mini-mysteries which are set to a lethal time limit with innocent people's lives hanging in the balance. This is a clever way to give the characters a chance to spar off each other in lieu of the fact they still have not yet met. Another particularly interesting focus on this story was on Holmes' attitude towards the victims. At this point, Holmes has made it clear that he has a pathological need to be interested in things. During this whole story, Holmes has been treating this as nothing more than a game. He gives no impression that he genuinely cares about those innocent people caught in the crossfire. This is the first real time that Watson confronts Holmes on his apathy. Watson has always been Holmes' morality resource, to remind Holmes of that human element. Holmes' endeavors need to go beyond his obsessive need to not be bored, that in this life there will be collateral damage. Problem is, prior to befriending Watson, the stakes never got personal. The last scene at the pool would have gone a hell of a lot worse if Watson was not in Sherlock's life. He would have blown himself and Moriarty up in a heartbeat, but when he sees that his first real friend is at risk, in that moment, Holmes begins to think beyond his own sphere. Seeing as this was going to be a brand new take on Sherlock Holmes, heretofore unseen by the masses, this story desperately needed to make sure that it had all of its ducks in a row. The best way to do it? Just set the first Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, in the now, and like the original novel, follow Watson all the way through it. Not only did it do an amazing job introducing us to Holmes as Watson's reactions would wind up echoing our own, it also worked that Stephen Moffat utilized Watson to introduce us to all the other characters who would be commonplace throughout the series, particularly Mrs. Hudson, Inspector Lestrade, and Mycroft Holmes, the latter of which was introduced to us to such a great effect that they taunted us into thinking that Mycroft was Moriarty. This also helped in making Watson a more dynamic character as we see him start as a broken man who gradually regains his zest for living again. In terms of adaptations, another interesting thing to point out about this one is that the message carved into the floor Rache in the novel actually was meant to say revenge in German, and Scotland Yard assumed it was Rachel. As a result, the story took a different route. This one, on the other hand, took a modern route and led to an intense match of wits between Sherlock and a serial killer. Through precise, well-planned plotting and character development, A Study in Pink makes for a wholly brilliant debut episode. We've already seen how dangerous a chess game between Moriarty and Holmes can be when they haven't even met, but when the fire starts, damn. Never once in your imagination could you ever consider that Sherlock Holmes could ever be desperate, but here? This is that moment where Sherlock, being Sherlock, actually blows up in his face. All the people he has antagonized come after him in droves once Moriarty plays the biggest prank on all of Britain. He convinces everybody that not only is Sherlock a fraud, but also committing many of the crimes he solves, which sets up a suitably intense chase across London, where the walls are closing around Sherlock with nary a friend to help him. Up to this point, Sherlock has always relied upon his own wits to win the day. It was at this point where all that changed. This was the moment when he realized how important his friends were to him, to the point where not only would he be willing to sacrifice himself to protect them, he would covertly rely upon those he takes for granted to fake his death. The Reichenbach Fall is one of the more unique retellings of the final battle between Holmes and Moriarty, particularly in the sense that it wasn't a physical duel like in other adaptations, but a definitive battle of wits between the two. Moriarty nudges Holmes to kill himself or suffer his friends dying. In the end, Holmes outwits him by convincing Moriarty that he would sooner risk his friends dying just to one-up Moriarty. Andrew Scott really gets to show off the full extent of his take on Moriarty in this one. He is so blasé and complacent when it comes to everything but Holmes. Holmes is the only person who can possibly compete with him. In the end, Moriarty was convinced that Sherlock was just as boring as everyone else. After Sherlock had topped himself, Moriarty would have continued raising hell until he found another person to compete with him. Other adaptations of this character had him as a calm, collected genius with no real leanings towards madness. Scott's, however, is well and truly a psychopath, and this was the story to let it show. Sherlock Holmes is one of the most complex personalities in fiction. He has made it explicitly clear that he doesn't see people the way everyone else does, and that also goes for the notion of sentiment. We've seen how callous he can be towards Molly Hooper up to this point, so we know what kind of woman he isn't interested in, so what kind of woman would be the type to turn the head of Sherlock Holmes? Meet Irene Adler, the dominatrix who brought Britain to its knees. In the original story, Irene Adler is the one woman to beat Holmes. She's cunning, manipulative, and dangerous. Like Holmes, she has an exceptional gift for reading people, only she uses her gift for domination. She understands Holmes better than anybody and knows how to get him to do her bidding. The tricky part is that, well, you can't tell when she's playing everybody. And that, of course, is the heart of why this is such a fun episode. Adler is such a stunningly written character that she stays as such all throughout, and it makes for a fun story. What's even better is that it culminates in an emotional moment when Holmes outwits her in probably one of the most painful ways. She had Britain at her feet, and the only cost was betraying the man she genuinely loved. In the end, Sherlock outwits her and leaves her on the run filled with regret. Until that final moment when Sherlock saves her from death's door, and you see that though he may not love her in the way that normal people love, he has a singular fondness for her that he will never have for anyone else. So, sorry to Molly and a sadistic laugh at the expense of Watson and Holmes shippers. This episode is one of the most intimate, and because of that, it's one of the most mischievous, one of the most delightful, and one of the most entertaining episodes of Sherlock. Do you agree? Do you disagree? How would you stack the series of Sherlock on an ascending scale? Leave it in the comments below, and for more addictive content on Narcotic Casserole, simply like, share, and subscribe. Click, and thou shalt be served. At least we all can agree that Una Stubbs is the best Mrs. Hudson ever!